Hernán Cortés was born in 1485 in the small town of Medellín, in the region of Extremadura, Spain. His family was of modest nobility, not wealthy, but proud of their lineage. From an early age, Cortés showed signs of restlessness and ambition. Spain at that time was undergoing dramatic changes. The Reconquista had ended, Columbus had opened the way to the New World, and opportunities for adventure and fortune seemed limitless. As a boy, Cortés was sent to study law at the University of Salamanca. Yet the academic life did not suit him. He was fascinated by stories of voyages across the ocean, of lands filled with gold and strange peoples. He abandoned his studies and returned home, determined to seek his destiny overseas. In 1504, at the age of 19, Cortés sailed to Hispaniola, one of the first Spanish colonies in the Caribbean. There he worked as a notary, learning the bureaucratic side of colonial life, but he also gained valuable experience in the rough realities of conquest and settlement. He participated in expeditions, fought against indigenous resistance, and began to build a reputation as a daring and resourceful man. A few years later, Cortés joined the conquest of Cuba under Diego Velázquez. He distinguished himself as a capable. After the fall of Tenochtitlan, the landscape of Mexico was transformed forever. The once thriving city, with its temples, palaces, and bustling markets, lay in ruins. The canals were filled with debris, the great pyramids toppled, and the survivors faced hunger, disease, and despair. Cortés and his men established their headquarters amid the destruction, beginning the process of reshaping the city into what would later become Mexico City. The conquest was not only a military triumph but also a cultural upheaval. Spanish priests arrived to spread Christianity, tearing down idols and temples, replacing them with churches. Indigenous traditions were suppressed, though many survived in hidden forms. The blending of Spanish and native cultures created a new society, but one marked by inequality and suffering. Cortés himself became governor of New Spain, wielding immense power. Yet his ambition and ruthlessness earned him enemies both in the colonies and back in Spain. Rival conquistadors accused him of cruelty and corruption. The Spanish crown, wary of any subject becoming too powerful, began to limit his authority. Cortés spent years defending his reputation, traveling back to Spain to plead his case before the king. Despite his political struggles, Cortés remained a figure of fascination. He was celebrated as the man who had toppled a mighty empire with only a handful of soldiers, but he was also condemned for the brutality of his methods. His legacy was complicated, a hero to some, a villain to others. The impact of his conquest rippled far beyond Mexico. The riches of the New World poured into Spain, fueling its rise as a global empire. Silver from the mines of the Americas financed wars in Europe, built palaces, and supported the arts. Yet this wealth came at a terrible cost. Millions of indigenous people perished from disease, forced labor, and violence. Entire cultures were erased, and the balance of power in the world shifted dramatically. Cortés lived out his later years in relative obscurity, embittered by the loss of influence. He died in 1547, but his story continued to echo through history. The conquest of Mexico became a symbol of the age of exploration, a tale of ambition, courage, betrayal, and tragedy. Even today, historians debate his motives and his actions. Was he driven by faith, by greed, or by destiny? Was he a genius strategist or simply a ruthless opportunist? The truth lies somewhere in between. What cannot be denied is that Hernán Cortés changed the course of history, leaving behind a legacy that still shapes the world we live in. The world into which Cortés stepped was not only vast but deeply complex. The Aztec Empire was a mosaic of cultures, languages, and traditions bound together by tribute and military power. Its capital, Tenochtitlan, was home to perhaps 200,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the world at the time. The Spaniards marveled at its markets, where thousands gathered daily to trade food, textiles, jewelry, and exotic goods. They were astonished by the engineering of the aqueducts, the causeways that connected the city to the mainland, and the temples that rose high above the lake. Yet beneath this grandeur lay a system of domination. Many subject peoples resented the Aztecs for their demands of tribute and for the practice of human sacrifice, which terrified the Spaniards and horrified their allies. Cortés understood that resentment could be turned into opportunity. He promised liberation, and in return he gained warriors, guides, and supplies. This alliance was the true foundation of his conquest. The Spaniards themselves were few in number, but they possessed weapons that gave them an edge. Steel swords, firearms, and cannons were unfamiliar to the Aztecs. Horses, never seen before in the Americas, struck fear into enemy ranks. Yet these advantages alone could not have toppled an empire. It was the combination of Spanish technology and indigenous support that made victory possible. As the campaign advanced, Cortés displayed both cunning and ruthlessness. He negotiated, threatened, and fought, always keeping his men under strict control. He inspired loyalty by sharing the spoils of war, but he also punished betrayal harshly. His charisma was undeniable, and even those who feared him often followed him. The confrontation with Moctezuma grew increasingly tense. The emperor, caught between diplomacy and resistance, struggled to maintain authority. When the Spaniards took him hostage, the empire's stability began to crumble. Rebellions erupted, and the Spaniards found themselves trapped in a city that had once welcomed them. The Night of Sorrows in 1520 was a turning point. As the Spaniards attempted to escape, they were attacked on the causeways. Arrows, spears, and stones rained down upon them. Many drowned in the lake, weighed down by gold they tried to carry. Cortés himself barely survived, retreating with a fraction of his force. It was a devastating loss, but it did not end the campaign. Cortés regrouped, rallying his allies and gathering reinforcements. He built brigantines, small ships, to control the lake around Tenochtitlan. Slowly, methodically, he tightened the siege. Hunger and disease ravaged the city. The once mighty capital fell into despair. Finally, in August 1521, Tenochtitlan surrendered. The empire was no more. The aftermath was catastrophic. The population of Mexico plummeted, not only from war but from epidemics brought by Europeans. Smallpox swept through communities, killing thousands, weakening resistance, and altering the balance of power. The Spaniards claimed victory, but it was disease as much as steel that determined the outcome. Cortés became the ruler of New Spain, but his triumph was shadowed by controversy. He sought recognition from the Spanish crown, yet his enemies accused him of tyranny. He returned to Spain to defend himself, presenting treasures and stories of conquest to the king. Though he was honored, his authority was curtailed. He spent his later years frustrated, longing for the glory he once held. His death in 1547 closed a chapter, but the consequences of his actions lived on. The conquest reshaped the Americas, opening them to European colonization, exploitation, and cultural transformation. It marked the beginning of centuries of struggle, blending, and survival. To understand the magnitude of Cortés's conquest, one must imagine the world of the Aztecs before the Spaniards arrived. Daily life in Tenochtitlan was vibrant and organized. Farmers cultivated maize, beans, and squash on ingenious floating gardens called chinampas. Merchants traveled long distances to bring cacao, jade, and exotic feathers to the city's bustling markets. Priests oversaw ceremonies in towering temples, where music, dance, and ritual sacrifice were performed to honor the gods. The Spaniards were both fascinated and horrified. They admired the engineering and artistry, yet recoiled at practices they considered barbaric. This clash of worldviews deepened the sense of destiny Cortés felt. He believed he was chosen to bring Christianity and European order to a land he saw as both magnificent and alien. The alliances Cortés forged were not merely military arrangements. They were complex negotiations. The Tlaxcalans, fierce enemies of the Aztecs, saw in the Spaniards a chance to break free from oppression. Their warriors fought alongside Cortés, and their knowledge of the land proved invaluable. Without these allies, the Spaniards would have been overwhelmed. As the siege of Tenochtitlan dragged on, the suffering was immense. Hunger gnawed at the population, and disease spread rapidly. The Spaniards cut off supplies, destroyed aqueducts, and used their brigantines to dominate the lake. The defenders fought bravely, but the odds were insurmountable. When the city finally fell, it was not only a military defeat but the collapse of a civilization. In the years that followed, Spanish rule reshaped every aspect of life. Churches rose where temples once stood. Spanish became the language of administration, though native tongues endured in villages and homes. The blending of cultures created new traditions, foods, and beliefs, but the scars of conquest remained. Cortés himself struggled to maintain control. His ambition often clashed with the interests of the crown. He dreamed of further conquests, even exploring Honduras, but his authority waned. Rivals undermined him, and the king limited his power. Though he was granted titles and estates, he never regained the absolute command he once held. In Spain, Cortés was both celebrated and distrusted. He presented treasures, gold, silver, and exotic artifacts to the royal court, dazzling audiences with tales of a city greater than any in Europe. Yet whispers of cruelty and greed followed him. He spent years petitioning for recognition, but his influence faded. By the time of his death in 1547, Cortés was a man of wealth but little power. He left behind a legacy that was both glorious and tragic. His conquest opened the door to European domination of the Americas, altering the course of history forever. The story of Hernán Cortés is not simply one of battles and victories. It is a tale of ambition, faith, betrayal, and resilience. It is the story of two worlds colliding with consequences that echo across centuries. The religious worldview of the Aztecs was central to their society. They believed the universe was sustained by the gods through cycles of creation and destruction, and that human sacrifice was necessary to maintain balance. Warriors captured in battle were offered to the gods, their blood seen as nourishment for the sun. To the Spaniards, this was shocking, yet to the Aztecs it was sacred duty. The clash between these beliefs was profound, and it fueled Cortés's conviction that he was bringing salvation to a land trapped in darkness. Spanish priests who accompanied the expedition saw themselves as missionaries. They baptized indigenous people, destroyed idols, and built churches on the ruins of temples. Yet conversion was not simple. Many natives blended Christian rituals with their own traditions, creating a unique fusion of faiths that survives to this day. The conquest also introduced new animals, plants, and technologies. Horses, cattle, and sheep transformed agriculture and transport. Wheat and sugarcane were planted, reshaping diets and economies. At the same time, native crops like maize, tomatoes, and cacao traveled to Europe, changing global cuisine forever. The Columbian Exchange, as historians call it, was one of the most significant shifts in human history, and Cortés's conquest was at its heart. Disease was perhaps the most devastating force. Smallpox, carried unknowingly by the Spaniards, swept through Mexico with terrifying speed. Entire communities were wiped out, leaders died, and resistance crumbled. The Spaniards themselves were immune, but the indigenous population had no defenses. This invisible weapon was as decisive as any cannon or sword. The fall of the Aztec Empire marked the beginning of Spanish dominance in the Americas. From Mexico, expeditions pushed north and south, claiming vast territories. Silver mines in places like Zacatecas and Potosí poured wealth into Spain, fueling its rise as a global empire. Yet this wealth also brought inflation, wars, and eventual decline. The riches of the New World were both a blessing and a curse. Cortés's personal life was equally complex. He fathered children with indigenous women, including Malintzin, also known as La Malinche, who served as his interpreter and advisor. She played a crucial role in negotiations, bridging languages and cultures. To some, she was a traitor; to others, a survivor who navigated impossible circumstances. Her story is inseparable from Cortés's, and her legacy remains debated in Mexico today. In his later years, Cortés sought recognition for his achievements. He returned to Spain, presented treasures to the king, and recounted his victories. Yet he was never fully trusted. The crown feared the power of conquistadors and sought to keep them in check. Cortés was granted lands and titles, but his authority was limited. He died in 1547, frustrated that his glory had faded, though his name would never be forgotten. The legacy of Hernán Cortés is one of contradiction. He was a man of vision and courage, yet also of cruelty and ambition. He brought down an empire, but at the cost of countless lives. He opened the door to a new world, but unleashed centuries of exploitation. His story is not simply about conquest. It is about the collision of civilizations, the reshaping of continents, and the enduring questions of power, faith, and destiny. Daily life in the Aztec world was rich with color and rhythm. Families lived in houses built of stone and adobe, often surrounding small courtyards where children played and elders told stories. Markets were the beating heart of the city, filled with the scent of roasted maize, cacao drinks, and flowers. Traders displayed obsidian blades, woven textiles, and jewelry crafted from turquoise and gold. Music echoed through the streets, with drums and flutes accompanying dances that honored the gods. Festivals were central to the calendar. Each month carried ceremonies dedicated to different deities, with processions, offerings, and elaborate costumes. Warriors painted their bodies, priests donned feathered headdresses, and the people gathered to witness rituals that bound them together in faith and tradition. To the Spaniards, these spectacles were both awe-inspiring and unsettling, reinforcing their belief that they had entered a world unlike any they had known. The Spaniards themselves lived under constant tension. They were few in number, surrounded by thousands, and dependent on their allies for survival. Every day was a test of endurance. Food was scarce, disease threatened, and morale wavered. Cortés kept discipline through strict orders and promises of wealth. He reminded his men that their names would be remembered if they triumphed, but forgotten if they faltered. The clash of civilizations was not only military but psychological. The Spaniards carried banners of the cross, convinced they were instruments of divine will. The Aztecs fought to preserve their gods, their city, and their way of life. Each side believed destiny was on their side, and this conviction made the conflict all the more intense. As the siege tightened, scenes of desperation unfolded. Families fled to the temples, seeking protection. Warriors fought with unmatched courage, even as hunger weakened them. The Spaniards advanced street by street, destroying bridges and cutting off supplies. The lake, once a source of life, became a barrier filled with Spanish brigantines that rained fire upon the defenders. When Tenochtitlan finally fell, silence replaced the sounds of battle. The city that had dazzled the world was reduced to rubble. Survivors wandered among ruins, mourning the loss of loved ones and the collapse of their civilization. For the Spaniards, it was victory. For the Aztecs, it was catastrophe. In the years that followed, Spanish colonial administration took shape. Viceroys governed in the name of the king, and encomiendas granted Spaniards control over land and labor. Indigenous people were forced into new systems of tribute and work, often under harsh conditions. Yet resistance never fully disappeared. Rebellions flared, traditions endured, and voices of defiance echoed across generations. Globally, the conquest of Mexico shifted the balance of power. Europe's appetite for wealth grew insatiable. Silver from the Americas fueled trade with Asia, linking continents in a new global economy. Spain became a superpower, but its dominance also sowed the seeds of conflict with rivals like England and France. The conquest of Mexico was not an isolated event. It was part of a chain reaction that reshaped the entire world. Among the most pivotal figures in Cortés's story was Malintzin, known to the Spaniards as Dona Marina, and later remembered as La Malinche. She was a Nahua woman who had been given to the Spaniards as part of a tribute. Fluent in both Nahuatl and Maya, she became Cortés's interpreter, advisor, and companion. Through her, Cortés could communicate with allies and rivals alike, bridging languages and cultures. Her role was indispensable. Without her, negotiations and alliances would have been far more difficult. La Malinche's legacy is complex. To some, she is seen as a traitor who aided the invaders. To others, she is a survivor who used her intelligence to navigate impossible circumstances. She bore Cortés a son, Martín, one of the first mestizos, a child of mixed Spanish and indigenous heritage. In this way, she symbolized the birth of a new society, one that blended cultures but carried the scars of conquest. Cortés's alliances were equally crucial. The Tlaxcalans, fierce enemies of the Aztecs, fought alongside him with determination. Their warriors, numbering in the thousands, gave the Spaniards strength they could never have achieved alone. Other groups, weary of Aztec tribute and sacrifice, joined the cause. These alliances reveal that the conquest was not simply Spaniards against Aztecs, but a complex civil war in which indigenous factions chose sides. The memory of the conquest has echoed through centuries. In Spain, Cortés was celebrated as a hero of empire, a man who brought unimaginable wealth and glory to the crown. His name was inscribed in chronicles, his deeds compared to those of Alexander the Great. Yet in Mexico, his memory was darker. He was remembered as the destroyer of a civilization, the bringer of suffering, and the symbol of foreign domination. Over time, the story of Cortés became part of national identity. In Mexico, La Malinche became a figure of debate, sometimes vilified, sometimes honored. The fall of Tenochtitlan was remembered not only as a tragedy but also as the beginning of a new culture, one that blended Spanish and indigenous elements into something unique. Globally, the conquest of Mexico marked a turning point. It demonstrated the power of European expansion, the vulnerability of great empires to disease and division, and the profound consequences of cultural collision. It set the stage for centuries of colonization, exploitation, and transformation across the Americas. Cortés himself, despite his triumph, ended his life in frustration. He longed for recognition equal to his achievements, but the crown kept him at arm's length. He died wealthy but embittered, his glory fading even as his name remained etched in history. The story of Hernán Cortés is not only about one man's ambition. It is about the meeting of worlds, the rise and fall of empires, and the enduring questions of conquest and legacy. It is a story that continues to resonate, reminding us of the power of human ambition and the cost of empire. Centuries after the fall of Tenochtitlan, the legacy of Hernán Cortés continues to shape Mexico and the wider world. The ruins of the Aztec capital lie beneath modern Mexico City, where skyscrapers rise above ancient stones, and traffic flows along causeways that once carried warriors and merchants. The memory of conquest is woven into the fabric of the nation, a reminder of both tragedy and resilience. In Mexican culture, Cortés is often remembered with ambivalence. He is the conqueror, the destroyer of a great civilization, yet also the origin of a new society that blends Spanish and indigenous traditions. La Malinche, his interpreter and companion, remains a symbol of this blending, sometimes condemned, sometimes honored, but always central to the story. Artists, writers, and historians have retold the tale for generations. In paintings, Cortés appears as a stern figure in armor, standing over fallen warriors. In literature, he is portrayed as both visionary and villain. In political discourse, his name is invoked as a reminder of colonial oppression, but also as a marker of the birth of modern Mexico. The debate over his legacy reflects the complexity of history itself. Globally, the conquest of Mexico was a turning point in the age of exploration. It demonstrated the reach of European power, the vulnerability of empires to disease and division, and the profound consequences of cultural collision. It set in motion centuries of colonization, reshaping continents, economies, and identities. The world we know today, interconnected, global, and diverse, was forged in part by events like Cortés's campaign. For Cortés himself, the glory he sought was fleeting. He died in 1547, frustrated that his achievements were not fully recognized by the crown. Yet history remembered him. His name became synonymous with conquest, ambition, and the clash of civilizations. He remains one of the most controversial figures of the 16th century, admired for his daring, condemned for his cruelty, and studied for the lessons his story offers. The story of Hernán Cortés is not simply about one man. It is about the meeting of worlds, the rise and fall of empires, and the enduring questions of power, faith, and destiny. It is about courage and brutality, vision and destruction, triumph and tragedy. It is a story that continues to resonate, reminding us that history is never simple and that the echoes of the past shape the present. And so, as the voice fades and the images of burning temples, marching soldiers, and silent ruins linger, the tale of Hernán Cortés stands complete, a saga of conquest and consequence, a story that changed the world forever.